Good morning. I'm David Barish, Chairman of the Gaming Control Board. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everybody to turn off their electronic devices. With us today is Fred Strathmeyer, representing Russell Redding, Secretary of Department of Agriculture, Jen Langen, representing Tim Reese, the State Treasurer, and Bob Coyne, representing Eileen McNulty, Secretary of Revenue. Thank you all for coming. Quorum of the board being present, as such, I will call today's meeting to order. First order of business, the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
By way of announcements, the board held an executive session yesterday, April 26th, for the purpose of discussing personnel matters and to conduct quasi-judicial deliberations relating to matters now before the board. Next, we have consideration of a motion to approve the minutes and transcripts of the March 2nd, 2016 meeting. May I have a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move that the board approve the minutes and transcript of the March 2nd, 2016 meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted. Next, we'll hear from our Executive Director, Kevin O'Toole.
Good morning, Chairman Barish, members of the board. Today's Executive Director's report will be given by our Director of Racetrack Gaming Operations, Kevin Kyle. Kevin is the author of our Racetrack Casino Benchmark Report, and we have recently issued our 9th annual report. So Kevin will give a brief summary of this year's report. Kevin?
Good morning, Chairman, members of the board. The Office of Racetrack Gaming recently completed and released the 9th Annual Benchmark Report, which provides an overview of the benefits slot machine gaming provides for the horse racing industry in Pennsylvania. This report also details key indicators within horse racing, which outline the health of the industry over the last 5 years. As you all know, one of the objectives of the Gaming Act is to assist horse racing in Pennsylvania. Approximately 11% of revenue generated from slot machine gaming, or $246 million, was earmarked for the Racehorse Development Fund in 2015. This revenue is utilized by statute to significantly enhance purses, provide health and pension benefits for horsemen, and assist breeding operations. The working conditions for horsemen has also been drastically improved as the racetrack casinos have invested an additional $65 million to improve the infrastructure on the backside of the tracks. The racing industry in Pennsylvania continues to struggle in its efforts to attract a new fan base, as evidenced by a reduction in wagering on the racing product. $722 million was wagered on live races held in Pennsylvania in 2015, representing a decrease of 6%. Decreases in handle can also be attributed to a dispute regarding simulcast rates, which negatively impacted 4 of the 6 tracks here. This impasse took place during the first quarter of 2015 and prevented patrons at 4 of the racetracks from wagering on races held at tracks such as Santa Anita, Gulfstream, Laurel Park, and others. This led to a 25% decline in taxable handle during the first 3 months of last year. The racetrack casinos are adjusting in order to improve performance. Several racetracks recently took steps to reduce the number of live racing days in an effort to boost purse dollars for large-scale events. For example, Parks Racing scheduled a fall festival in 2015, which ran for 8 weeks and purses averaged $500,000 a day. The festival was funded by money saved by racing fewer dates. Parks ran 185 days in 2015, but under a new agreement with the Horsemen, will race 156 days in 2016, and they are currently in the process of scheduling a variation of the festival for this year. This new initiative is in contrast to the past, where more racing days were scheduled with lower purses and fewer horses entered per race. Despite the challenges facing the horse racing industry, revenue generated from slot machine gaming continues to provide a positive impact on live racing in Pennsylvania and continues to benefit agriculture within the Commonwealth. It is important to note that while this is the second year since gaming commenced that live racing handle declined year over year, total live racing handle in 2015 was 24% higher when compared to the same time period before gaming commenced in 2006. This new report is available to the public and can be found on the board's website directly on our homepage. Thank you, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Just one question for you. I noticed a commercial on TV last night from the Horseman. It's talking about a $4 billion industry and how much it's affected. Are you familiar with the campaign? What is that about? The extent of it?
That's run by the Horsemen's organizations themselves, and of course they're trying to promote the industry as much as they can as well. So not only are the racetracks trying to improve their product, but the Horsemen are attempting and are being proactive and trying to attract people to the sport.
I didn't know if it was just a central Pennsylvania action or if they bought TV time in other markets in the state.
I'm not sure, but I could definitely find out for you.
Thank you.
Kevin, could you give us the reasons why on the simulcast that Santa and Anita, they weren't accepting the wagers? What were the circumstances? And what have we done to, as a follow-up, what have we done to make sure it doesn't happen again?
There's cooperatives throughout the nation, and this involved two cooperatives that affected 4 of our tracks. It's the Mid-Atlantic Cooperative, which represents 23 racetracks, mainly through the Mid-Atlantic region, and then the other party was the Monarch Content Management Group, which is led by the Strana Group. And in essence, all tracks throughout the country negotiate signal fee rates. And it's my understanding that the Monarch Group wanted to increase some rates for certain tracks, and it led to basically a boycott. And they couldn't come to an agreement on what those signal fee rates should be. So hopefully it doesn't happen in the future. So far this year, everything is on course as normal, so I don't anticipate it being a problem in the future moving forward.
I have a question. You said that what happened in the first quarter of 2015 resulted in a 25% less. Was that just at those tracks or total? What was that?
That was taxable handle. So at the 6 tracks in Pennsylvania, taxable handle last year was about $100 million. So there was approximately 24, 25.
If that hadn't happened, would we have seen, I know it's hard to predict, but without that, in a steady state, would we have not seen a year-to-year decline?
I think it would have been relatively flat.
Okay.
Nationwide, there was a handle, both in thoroughbred and standardbred, was flat last year. There was a slight increase. Nationwide, less than 1%.
I see.
Overall, for the entire year, taxable handle was down 11%. So to put that in perspective, if the first quarter wasn't down 25%, I think we would have been in
We would have
much
been
better
more
shape.
with the national average of what's happening, basically.
What's that?
We would have been more consistent with the national
I
average.
believe so, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, Dave, in the past, I didn't see the recent commercials, but I know when the Horsemen had legislation pending in the past, I've seen them run those kind of pro-Horseman commercials. I haven't seen them for a couple of years, but I do know that I've seen them before. But, Fred, I have a question for you, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. Is there anything that Ag is doing or contemplating, or do you guys have concerns about, the decrease in just horse racing play around the state? And before you answer, I do remember a couple of years ago, you guys were running commercials. I don't know if they were on TV or on the internet about Track Pack or something along those lines. Is what's going on in Ag vis-a-vis promoting horse racing?
Okay. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. We, in Act 7, we were able to get a 1% marketing and promotions through, which, when you do the math, it's basically $2.4 million that we will have available. That is a carryover. In other words, if we don't spend it all the first year, we continue to build that pot. The intent from MAG is to reach out to stakeholders and then have them part of the process. At this point, there's no firm plans because, as all of you know, there's no commission in place right now. And so until the commission is seated, those types of definitive things will have to wait until that's in place. But overall, it's for the first time has given us a steady stream of income for promotion and marketing. And certainly the Department of Ag is going to make best use of those dollars.
Thank you.
Chairman, I have a question. Yeah. Kevin, remind me the percentage of folks last year that were actually sitting in the stands themselves and putting their money down on horse racing.
Attendance was actually down this past year, and it's the first year. It's the first decline in the past 5 years. So there was about 760,000 patrons that went to the racetracks in Pennsylvania. That's down 7%.
And what was the percent of the handle that they bet as opposed to the simulcasting?
In 2015, I don't have an actual percentage for on-track handle, but I can get that for you. But there was $30 million wagered at the actual tracks on Pennsylvania's races. That's down 6%.
Do you have a sense, though, of proportionality? Is it a much smaller percent that it's actually bet in the stands?
It is.
Much, much smaller?
It
and
is.
much, much larger? I mean, that's a sense that I had. I should see that number somewhere. Being somewhat new, I said, wow, I didn't realize that. I mean, and nothing to refer to.
But back in the early days of horse racing, it was the only game in town. But since simulcast wagering came on board, the majority of wagers are placed through simulcast wagering via off-track wagering facilities, the internet, mobile devices, etc.
Mm-hmm. But yet we see on racing days and evenings a higher number of folks that at the racinos going to the casinos.
That's correct.
Thank you.
I think that's the only questions. Anything else, Kevin?
Nothing else, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Next up, Director of Human Resources, Claire.
Good morning, Chairman and board members. The Office of Human Resources has one motion for your consideration today relative to the hiring of 3 individuals. Mr. Edglar Mataj has been selected as a technical field representative assigned to Parks Casino. Mr. Mataj has completed the PGCB interview process, background investigation, and drug screening, and is recommended for hire by Director of Casino Compliance Jerry Stoll. Additionally, Mr. Adam Bashline and Ms. Melanie Little have been selected as forensic accountants in the Bureau of Investigation and Enforcement's Financial Investigations Unit. Mr. Bashline and Ms. Little have also completed the PGCB interview process, background investigation, and drug screening, and are recommended for hire by Director of BIE Paul Morrow. Unless you have any questions, I ask that the Board consider a motion to hire Mr. Mataj, Mr. Bashline, and Ms. Little as indicated.
Are there any questions from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the Board approve the applicants as proposed by the Director of Human Resources.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Director of Financial Management, Dave Wren.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My report today will provide an overview of expenditures incurred by the board through the end of the fiscal year's third quarter on March 31st. Spending as of that date totaled $27.1 million. Spending for the third quarter alone was slightly over $10 million. The majority of expenditures to date are for payroll. Payroll expenses in the first 3 quarters totaled $23.9 million, or 88% of total expenses for the fiscal year, with salaries totaling $14.3 million and benefits totaling $9.6 million. The expenditures for benefits equate to 67% of the total spent on salaries. Payroll for the third quarter alone was $8.98 million. Payroll expenses for the fiscal year to date are up 2.7%, while the average employee count is down by 12 employees. Operating and fixed asset expenses recorded in the third quarter totaled slightly over $1 million, bringing the year-to-date total to $3.2 million. Operating and fixed asset expenses comprise under 12% of overall agency expenditures. 78% of operating expenditures, or $2.4 million, were for office and parking leases, services, and other operating expenses, which are primarily subscription costs for databases used in background investigations. Overall expenditures for the fiscal year are within budget and below expectations due to the declining complement levels over the first 3 quarters of the fiscal year.
Any questions for Dave? Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Chief Counsel Doug Sherman.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the board. Our first agenda item relates to a local law enforcement grant application, which Assistant Chief Counsel Denise Miller-Schutte is here to present.
Good morning. The local law enforcement grant that I have to present to you today is from the Lawrence County District Attorney's Office. The office is requesting a 2-year grant. If awarded, this would be the first grant awarded to the Lawrence County District Attorney's Office. The office intends to use the grant funds to tackle a new initiative focusing on small games of chance licenses and violations, as well as illegal gaming in general. More specifically, the office initiative will focus on education, monitoring of current small games of chance licensees, and the investigation and prosecution under the small games of chance law and illegal gaming laws. In year 1, they're requesting a $75,000 grant, which will pay for the salary and benefits of 1 detective, supplement 2 of the assistant district attorneys, and pay for training for all 3 employees. Year 2, they're requesting $50,000, which will pay for half the salary and benefits of the detective, supplement the assistant district attorneys, as well as have some more training for those 3 individuals. I have reviewed the application. They meet the guidelines of the board, and I would request that there be a motion made to approve the grant.
Any questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the local law enforcement grant for the Lawrence County District Attorney's Office as described by the Office of Chief Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today we have 3 petitions before you for your consideration. The matters each will be decided upon the record, and the board's been provided with a complete pleadings and evidentiary record in each case. The first petition is that of related to United States Playing Card Company, and it's a petition for approval of the change of control of the United States Playing Card Company. The petition was filed by the parent company, Jarden Corporation. In addition, a motion to protect confidential information has also been submitted. By way of background, U.S. Playing Card Company is a table game manufacturer licensee that manufactures playing cards and other table game related devices. Jarden is a publicly traded affiliate licensee and the ultimate parent company of U.S. Playing Cards. Jarden also owns many other lines of consumer products, including Coleman, Sunbeam, and Rawlings Sporting Goods. Jarden is in the process of merging with Newell Rubbermaid Company, also a publicly traded company, which owns a wide variety of brands, also including Sharp, Graco, and Lennox. As a result of the merger, Newell Brands will become the ultimate parent company of U.S. Playing Cards. The Office of Enforcement Counsel has no objection to the petition for the change of control, subject to U.S. Playing Cards following the necessary licensing requirements for any new entity or individual required to be licensed as a result of the merger. In addition, U.S. Playing Cards will provide the Office of Enforcement Counsel with all final closing documents related to the merger. Finally, the Office of Enforcement Counsel has no objection to the confidentiality motion for certain proprietary information. I would note for the record that Newell Rubber and 4 individuals associated with that company have already filed applications, so the process is well underway here from the licensing perspective. And with that, I'd request a motion from the board to consider the change of control.
Any questions, comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve both Jarden Corporation's petition for approval of change of control and its motion for confidentiality as described by the Office of Chief Counsel.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
The next petition before the board pertains to Che Shim's request to be removed from the involuntary exclusion list. In July of 2014, the Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a complaint to place Che Shim on the board's exclusion list, alleging that he assisted his 20-year-old son, Dae Shim, to gain access to the gaming floor. Mr. Shim and his son were on the floor for about 10 minutes. Mr. Che Shim gamed, but his son did not. The parties signed a consent agreement in October 2014, and the board approved the agreement on December 10th, 2014, placing Mr. Che Shim on the exclusion list for a period of at least 1 year from the date of the order. In February 2016, the board received a request from Che Shim and his son, Dae Shim, also seeking removal from the exclusion list as 1 year had passed from their placement on the list. Having no evidence that either Mr. Shim or his son had in any way violated the board's order, the Office of Enforcement Counsel has not objected to the removal from the exclusion list for either individual. First up would be a motion concerning Che Shim, the father.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the petition of Che L. Shim seeking removal from the involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Chief Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
And the second motion, which I would ask the board to make, relates to the son, Dae Shim. Again, the facts are the same, and it would be appropriate for the board's consideration at this time.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the petition of Dae Y. Shim seeking removal from the involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Chief Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Next, presenting withdrawals and reports and recommendations is Deputy Chief Counsel Steve Cook.
Morning. The board has received 4 unopposed petitions to withdraw the applications or surrender the credentials of individuals or businesses. The persons and one entity subject to these petitions are as follows: Gary Canale Designs, LLC, David Patent, Ryoichi Kimura, and Greg Hart. The Office of Enforcement Counsel has no objection to any of these withdrawals or surrenders. As a result, if the board were inclined to grant same, they'd be doing so without prejudice, and these matters are now ripe for the board's consideration.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue orders to approve the withdrawals and surrenders as described by the Office of Chief Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Next before the board for consideration are 2 reports and recommendations received from the Office of Hearings and Appeals. These reports and recommendations, along with the complete evidentiary record in each matter, have been provided to the board in advance of this meeting. Additionally, in each case, the gentlemen that are the subject of these 2 reports and recommendations have been put on notice that the board would be taking their matter up today and that they could come forward and briefly address the board. If either of these individuals are present, I would ask them to come forward when their matter is called. The first report and recommendation before the board pertains to Nicholas Tiernan. On November 19, 2015, the Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a complaint to place Mr. Tiernan on the exclusion list, alleging that on April 23, 2015, this gentleman offered to help an elderly patron at Parks who was having difficulty inserting a voucher in a slot machine. When he was unable to insert the voucher in the machine himself, he told her that he would redeem it for cash at the cage.
left the woman, went to the cage, in fact redeemed it for cash, but then left the casino without returning the $84 in cash to the woman. Upon being identified and contacted by the Pennsylvania State Police, Mr. Tiernan returned to the casino and turned the money over to the state police. As a result of his actions, Mr. Tiernan was charged and convicted of theft and was permanently evicted from parks. At Mr. Tiernan's request, a hearing in this matter was held on January 20th, 2016. Despite receiving proper notice, however, he failed to attend at that hearing, and it was held in his absence. As a result of the evidence presented by Enforcement Counsel, the report and recommendation subsequently issued recommends that he be placed on the exclusion list, and that is the recommendation for the board at present.
Any questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board adopt the report and recommendation issued by the Office of Hearings and Appeals regarding the placement of Nicholas Tiernan on the PGCB involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Chief Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
The second and final report and recommendation before the board today pertains to Michael Witzak III. On July 27, 2015, the Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a complaint to place Mr. Witzak on the exclusion list, alleging that between 2012 and 2015, he had been involved in a number of incidents at the Parks Casino that included physical aggression toward other patrons, as well as, on one occasion, theft of a mislaid voucher. Ultimately, one of the assaults that occurred at the Parks Casino resulted in his being charged and convicted of disorderly conduct. Mr. Witzak never responded to the Office of Enforcement Counsel's complaint, and as a result, in October of 2015, OEC filed a request for a default judgment. Prior to the board acting on that request, however, Mr. Witzak requested a hearing stating that he'd been incarcerated and never received notice. As a result, the matter was remanded back to the board's Office of Hearings and Appeals. A hearing was scheduled and notice was again sent to him at his address of record. He again did not appear at that hearing. It was held in his absence. Ultimately, OEC presented evidence of the bad behavior at Parks, and the report and recommendation subsequently issued that is presently before the board recommends that he be placed on the exclusion list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move the board adopt the report and recommendation issued by the Office of Hearings and Appeals regarding the placement of Michael Witzak III on the PGCB involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Chief Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
And that concludes all matters in the
Thank you.
Office of Chief Counsel.
Next, we have Sean Hannon, Manager of the Bureau of Licensing.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the board. Before the board today will be motions regarding one table game manufacturer renewal licensee, 871 principal, key, gaming, and non-gaming employees. In addition, there will be consideration of 19 gaming service provider applicants. The first matter for your consideration is the renewal of the South Jersey Precision Tool and Mold Incorporated table game manufacturer license. The Bureau of Investigations and Enforcement has completed its investigation of the company, and the Bureau of Licensing has provided you with a background investigation and suitability report regarding the renewal. South Jersey Precision has asked that the board grant it a reduced licensing fee for its table game manufacturer license. The renewal fee for a manufacturer is $90,000 for a 3-year license. Under the Gaming Act, the board may modify the fee for a table game manufacturer if it determines that the fee will unreasonably limit table game devices or associated equipment. Consistent with this provision of the Act, the Bureau of Licensing has adopted a reduced licensing fee policy, which has previously been presented to the board. Pursuant to that policy, a reduction of the fee, the licensing fee to zero, is warranted if there is only one manufacturer of a product and anticipated sales are less than $100,000 annually. South Jersey Precision is the only manufacturer in Pennsylvania that produces pie-gow tiles, and its projected annual sales are under $100,000. The Bureau of Licensing, therefore, recommends that the board grant a reduced licensing fee of zero to South Jersey Precision. I have provided you with the draft order for this entity and ask that the board consider the order to renew the table game manufacturer license for South Jersey Precision Tool and Mold Incorporated.
Questions, comments from Enforcement Counsel?
Enforcement Counsel has no objection.
Any comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board approve the table game manufacturer license renewal of South Jersey Precision Tool and Mold, Inc., with a reduced fee consistent with the Bureau of Licensing's policy.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Also for your consideration is the approval of principal and key employee licenses. Prior to this meeting, the Bureau of Licensing provided you with a proposed order for 11 principal and 15 key employee licenses. I ask that the board consider the order approving these licenses.
Comments from Enforcement Counsel?
Enforcement Counsel has no objection.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board approve the issuance of principal and key employee licenses as described by the Bureau of Licensing.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Next are temporary principal and key employee licenses. The Bureau of Licensing provided you with an order regarding the issuance of temporary licenses for 3 principal and 3 key employee licenses. I ask that the board consider the order approving these licenses.
Comments from Enforcement Counsel?
Enforcement Counsel has no objection.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board approve the issuance of temporary principal and key employee credentials as described by the Bureau of Licensing.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
There are also gaming permits and non-gaming registrations. Prior to this meeting, the Bureau of Licensing provided you with a list of 570 individuals to whom the Bureau has granted temporary or full occupation permits, and 237 individuals to whom the Bureau has granted registrations under the authority delegated to the Bureau of Licensing. I ask that the board consider a motion approving the order.
Comments from Enforcement Counsel?
Enforcement Counsel has no objection.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board approve the issuance of gaming employee permits and non-gaming employee registrations as described by the Bureau of Licensing.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Next, there are recommendations of denial for 2 gaming and 2 non-gaming employee applicants. In each case, the applicant failed to request a hearing within the specified time frame. The Bureau of Licensing has provided you with orders addressing the applicants who the Office of Enforcement Counsel has recommended for denial. I ask that the board consider a motion approving the denials.
Enforcement Counsel?
Enforcement Counsel continues to request denial in each instance.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Chairman, I move that the board deny the gaming and non-gaming employee applications as described by the Bureau of Licensing.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Also for your consideration are withdrawal requests for key, gaming, and non-gaming employees. In each case, the permit or registration is no longer required. For today's meeting, I have provided the board with a list of 1 key, 13 gaming, and 14 non-gaming employee withdrawals for approval. I ask that the board consider the orders approving the list of withdrawals.
Enforcement Counsel?
Enforcement Counsel has no objection.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move the board approve the withdrawals as described by the Bureau of Licensing.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Next, we have an order to certify the following gaming service providers: Briscoe Food Service, LLC, doing business as Trimark SS Kemp, EMMS Electric, Incorporated, Prevail Marketing, LLC, doing business as Prevail Promotions, U.S. Foods, Incorporated. I ask that the board consider the order approving these gaming service providers for certification.
Enforcement Counsel?
Enforcement Counsel has no objection.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the applications for gaming service provider certification as described by the Bureau of Licensing.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Finally, for your consideration are gaming service provider registrations. The Bureau of Licensing provided you with an order and attached list of 15 registered gaming service providers. I ask that the board consider the order registering these gaming service providers.
Enforcement Counsel?
Enforcement Counsel has no objection.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the applications for gaming service provider registration as described by the Bureau of Licensing.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
That concludes the Bureau of Licensing matters.
Thanks, Sean. Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the Board. The Office of Enforcement Counsel will present 26 matters for the Board's consideration today, consisting of 5 consent agreements, 3 revocations, and 18 involuntary exclusion. The first consent agreement that will be heard has been negotiated between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Holdings Acquisition Co. doing business as Rivers Casino. The matter will be presented by Assistant Enforcement Counsel John Crow.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the Board. John Crow, CROHE, for the Office of Enforcement Counsel. The next matter on the agenda for the Board's consideration is a consent agreement reached between Rivers Casino and the Office of Enforcement Counsel regarding the employment of an unlicensed individual. On May 14, 2014, a former Rivers Casino table games dealer submitted a renewal application for his gaming permit, and on August 13, 2014, OEC issued the former dealer a recommendation of denial. On October 8, 2014, the Board issued an order denying the individual's renewal application. On October 14, 2014, the Board's application denial order was sent via email to Rivers Vice President of Human Resources. The unlicensed individual continued to be employed by Rivers until November 7, 2014. After notice was given to Rivers Casino, the unlicensed individual worked on 16 separate days for a total of 122 and a half hours without a valid gaming permit. The Office of Enforcement Counsel and Rivers respectfully request that the Board approve the consent agreement and stipulations of settlement, which require that Rivers implement policy and procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future, and that Rivers pay a civil penalty of $7,500 as well as $2,500 for costs incurred by the Board staff in connection with investigations in this matter. I believe Attorney Mr. Donnelly for Rivers is here to answer questions on Rivers' behalf.
Thank you, John. John Donnelly, on Donnelly, on behalf of Rivers. Also with me is Danielle Cisneros, who is Senior Counsel for Rivers, and Andre Barbary, who is now Vice President of Slots at Rivers.
Perhaps Mr. Sorry, I didn't catch the last. Barnaby should stand up and be sworn.
Barnaby, Barnabei.
If you would stand up and be sworn, please. Thank you.
We've had extensive negotiations with regard to this consent, and I agree with John that we've instituted procedures to stop. What occurred here was there was an email that went to Mr. Barnaby, who was on vacation. It bounced back with I'm out today on this particular matter. When he returned from vacation, he forwarded to, maybe while he's on vacation, to 2 other people. The other people who forwarded failed to take action, and that's how this event occurred. It was human error. We've instituted a number of things to try to fix this. Number one, we've asked, and the staff has agreed that in the future that emails go to a number of people. So if someone's on vacation, there's more than one person who gets that. And also we've asked that the representatives on the property obtain copies as well. And I think that'll cure these problems in the future.
Any questions or comments from the Board on this matter? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the Board issue an order to approve the consent agreement between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Holdings Acquisition Company, LP, as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? The motion's adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next matter on the agenda is a consent agreement that has been negotiated between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Mountain View Thoroughbred Racing Association doing business as Hollywood Casino at Penn National Racecourse. Once again, the matter will be presented by Assistant Enforcement Counsel John Crow.
The next matter on the Board's agenda between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Hollywood Casino relates to a violation of underage gaming. On January 1st, 2016, an underage individual entered Hollywood Casino after a security guard inspected the underage individual's military identification, which showed a date of birth of May 30th, 1997, making him 18 years of age at the time. Despite the patron's age, the security officer gave the underage individual a green wristband to signify that he was over 21 years of age. The underage individual then gamed at a slot machine for approximately 1 minute and a second slot machine for approximately 23 minutes. The underage individual was then stopped by another security officer who asked him to produce identification. After the true age of the individual was discovered, a security supervisor escorted the underage individual to the security podium and evicted him. The underage individual was on the gaming floor for a total of 55 minutes and gamed for a total of 24 minutes. Hollywood Casino issued a final written warning to the security officer who allowed the underage individual to access the gaming floor. The Office of Enforcement Counsel and Hollywood Casino respectfully request that the board approve this consent agreement and stipulations of settlement, which require that Hollywood implement policies and procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future, and that Hollywood pay a civil penalty of $7,500 as well as $2,500 for costs incurred by the board staff in connection with investigations in this matter. Attorney Alex Vizda from Hollywood Casino is here to answer questions on Hollywood's behalf.
Good morning. Could you spell your name for the court reporter?
Yes, it's Vizda, H-V-I-Z-D-A. This was essentially a human error. We have military IDs. Our scanning system at the door does not currently allow for scanning of military IDs. The vendor says they're working on a solution, but they don't have one yet. As a backup for that, employees are supposed to call over the date of birth over the radio as a double check. In this case, the officer just completely failed to do his job. He admitted that he just got complacent, that it would never happen again. He apologized to his coworkers. At our casino, we have a program called 100 for 100, where if our security department goes 100 days without any underage incidents, everyone in the department gets $100. We have not had another underage incident since this incident on New Year's Day. I think it was a week and a half ago. We paid out the 100 for 100, which is the 7th time we've done that for our security department.
Any questions or comments from the board?
Mr. Chairman, just as a general rule, and I've said this before, and I know you guys do this, but anytime somebody comes in with a military ID or something other than, what you can scan and verify, I always ask the casinos to please put your employees on high alert. We see this time and time again where they'll come in with a passport or a military ID are the two examples that we see the most. But your antenna needs to go up as a security guard when somebody presents something other than a driver's license. That's correct.
Any other comments? May I have a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the consent agreement between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Mountain View Thoroughbred Racing Association as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
The next two matters on the agenda are consent agreements that have been negotiated between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and HSP Gaming LP doing business as Sugar House Casino. Both matters will be presented by Assistant Enforcement Counsel James Armstrong.
Morning. Excuse me. Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners. The next matter on the agenda for the board's consideration is a consent agreement reached between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Sugar House Casino in regard to two subjects on the board's involuntary state exclusion list being permitted to gamble at Sugar House Casino. In the first incident, surveillance recordings revealed that a state-excluded individual, Christopher Cavelli, entered Sugar House's poker room at 7:31 p.m. on February 4, 2015. He went to the player's services desk and requested a player's card. Surveillance coverage of the transaction showed that the state-excluded patron was given a player's card. The patron went to a poker room cashier and handed her the player's card and money to buy chips. The cashier noticed a note on the excluded patron's account and had notified the cage manager. The state-excluded patron tried to sign up for a poker tournament, but the main desk employees had been advised of his status and reportedly tried to stall him. The state-excluded patron left the poker room before he could be taken into custody by security. The investigation further revealed that on January 28th, the same state-excluded patron entered the Sugar House Casino poker room. On that date, surveillance coverage showed that the state-excluded patron went to the desk and signed up for a poker tournament. After being issued a new player's card, the state-excluded patron went to the cage in the poker room where he bought in to play in the tournament, handing the cashier his new player's card and identification. Surveillance coverage showed that the cashier swiped the player's card and returned it and his identification without incident. Surveillance coverage showed that the state-excluded patron played in a poker tournament for more than 6 hours on January 28th. Commissioners, in the second incident, the surveillance recordings revealed that a state-excluded individual, an Erickson Uchero, entered Sugar House's poker room on April 6, 2015, and went to the cage and bought in. Surveillance coverage showed that Mr. Uchero played poker off and on for more than an hour. The state-excluded patron went to the poker room and attempted to enter the casino, but was asked for identification by security and turned down. He returned to the poker room at 11:22 p.m. and played poker until 12:44 a.m. At 12:34 a.m. on April 7th, a dealer was conducting a chip run and observed the excluded patron playing poker. The dealer recognized the patron as someone who was on the board's state exclusion list. The dealer went to the poker room host desk at 12:40 a.m. and advised his supervisor that he suspected the patron on the board's state exclusion list. After the supervisor walked past the patron, surveillance coverage showed that the excluded patron left the poker game and followed the supervisor to the host desk, where they engaged in a conversation for 5 minutes. During the conversation, the excluded patron was observed on surveillance coverage going around the side of the host desk and looking at the exclusion advisory on the computer screen. Shortly afterwards, the state-excluded patron collected his chips and cashed out. He was not stopped by poker room personnel or security officers. The poker room supervisor claimed he did not want to make notification in front of the excluded person, so he waited until the state-excluded patron left the host desk. Chairman, Commissioners, the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Sugar House Casino respectfully request the Board approve the proposed consent agreement and stipulation of settlement, which requires Sugar House to maintain policies and training to prevent similar violations of the Board's state exclusion list, for Sugar House to pay a civil penalty in the amount of $1,500, as well as pay $2,500 for costs incurred by the Office of Enforcement Counsel and other board staff in connection with this investigation.
Thank you.
Jackie, we'll be glad to answer. Mr. Donnelly's here on behalf of Sugar House Casino.
We've had lengthy discussions on the facts of this matter, as with the next consent that you'll hear, so these aren't lightly done. I think Mr. Armstrong and I spent hours and hours going over. We investigated the facts, went back over our surveillance and so on. And the bottom line is the facts are accurate, as Mr. Armstrong reported. Cavalli got by the system by coming in with putting an initial in his name, John M. Donnelly, as opposed to John Donnelly. A new card was issued. We now have a system that at least puts an alert through. It's an electronic system that puts an alert through when there's very similar names, and hopefully that'll stop it in part. He actively tried to evade the system and was successful for a while. We did catch both of these guys ultimately. And the second one, Telco, he was put out of the building by one security guard, and he sneaked back in. And the problem here was that he was allowed to cash out, and we've made it a point to retrain everybody. And when these incidents occur, you don't let people cash out. Don't let them get the chips. Some people are very aggressive, and oftentimes state police are not around, and so on. But the particular human being who allowed him to cash out, in this case, got a warning in his jacket letter, and we've been very aggressive on this cashing out policy and making sure people don't let these folks cash out, or prevent them from getting their hands on the chips, period, and not let them have the chips.
Are there any questions or comments from the board?
Quick question. Mr. Armstrong, we've run into this before where somebody's name is entered into the exclusion list, Samuel Adams, and then comes in and, gets another card, Sam Adams. Do we know if other casinos and can you or us require these casinos to adopt the same kind of system that Mr. Donnelly just explained, where at least an alert will come up if it's a similar name, if not the exact name?
Yeah. The problem with, in this instance, the Sugar House has been the only casino that has allowed, we've fined for having state exclusion, those that we put on the public exclusion list. So that's a lot easier. Those are a lot easier to catch. We're a little bit more lenient with self-excluded people because we understand the different names and the variances and everything that can go along with that. A lot of the casinos have strictly issued a first and last name. So where even if you punch in the initial, that name will come up and the last name. So if it was C. Petrie, then every name that starts with a C and ends with Petrie will populate, so that you can try to address that issue. It's not going to be 100% foolproof, and we're not looking for perfection. But in these instances where you have an individual get twice a player's card and sits at the poker table for hours and plays, and where an individual is allowed to cash out chips, that kind of sends the message that, okay, something else needs to be done in order to cut this short. So there's always going to be a way around the system, but when you have things that kind of go a little bit farther than they should, that's where we think, we need to take a little bit more strenuous action. But the casinos have put in fail-safe mechanisms to try to catch instances like that on the first time around.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the consent agreement between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and HSP Gaming, LP, as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Thank you. Chairman, Commissioners, the next matter on the agenda for the board's consideration is a consent agreement reached between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Sugar House Casino in regard to 3 subjects on the board's self-exclusion list being permitted to gamble at Sugar House Casino. In the first incident, surveillance recordings revealed a self-excluded individual entered Sugar House's poker room at 9:24 p.m. on February 19, 2015, and played poker for several hours. He subsequently went into the casino and gambled at blackjack and 3-card poker for several hours. The self-excluded patron briefly left the casino. He re-entered the casino and took a seat at a blackjack game at 1:51 a.m., where he played blackjack for the next 20 minutes. At 2:12 a.m. on February 20th, the self-excluded patron initiated a buy-in at a blackjack game and handed the dealer his identification to be rated. The table game's supervisor scanned the driver's license, and the Sugar House Casino management system indicated that the patron was barred and on the board's self-exclusion list. The table game supervisor contacted the table game's shift manager in regards to the patron being on the self-exclusion list. While the supervisor waited for the shift manager, the self-excluded patron was allowed to continue playing blackjack. The patron played 3 more hands, and on the 3rd hand, won a $5,000 jackpot. The table game supervisor then instructed the dealer to stop the game while the jackpot was verified by the surveillance department. The self-excluded patron was subsequently paid the jackpot. The self-excluded patron left the blackjack game with $5,600 in chips in his possession. He was confronted by security and escorted off the gaming floor to the security department's office. Security personnel did not confiscate the winnings. The Bureau of Casino Compliance and Pennsylvania State Police responded to the security department's office, and the police took custody of the self-excluded patron. The police searched the self-excluded patron incident to the arrest and found $2,000 in chips in his socks. They did not find the remaining $3,600. Pennsylvania State Police issued the patron a citation for trespassing and escorted him off of Sugar House property. He was also issued a formal eviction by the security personnel. Commissioners, in the second incident, a self-excluded individual entered the Sugar House poker room at 12:45 p.m. on August 23, 2015. Surveillance coverage showed the self-excluded patron went to the cage where he bought in for $200. The patron sat down at a table and began playing poker. The self-excluded patron played poker from 12:46 p.m. through 1:09 p.m., at which time he was identified as someone on the board's self-exclusion list and approached by a security department manager. The self-excluded patron stepped away from the poker game for several minutes and spoke with the security manager. At 1:11 p.m., the self-excluded patron sat back down at the poker game and resumed playing while the security manager confirmed his identity. At 1:12 p.m., the self-excluded patron was dealt another hand, which he won and was paid. The self-excluded patron cashed out for $244 at 1:15 p.m. Surveillance coverage showed the security manager and a security officer with the self-excluded patron walked him out of the poker room and into the parking lot. The security manager followed the self-excluded patron to his vehicle, which left the property at 1:16 p.m. No funds received from the self-excluded patron, nor was he cited by the Pennsylvania State Police. Commissioners, in the third incident, a self-excluded patron entered Sugar House Casino at 8:15 p.m. on September 16, 2015. The self-excluded patron sat down at a blackjack game where he brought in for $100 and began playing blackjack. At 8:30 p.m., he went to Pit 5 where he sat down at a Spanish 21 game. The self-excluded patron played Spanish 21 until 9:13 p.m. The self-excluded patron went to the temporary Rush Rewards desk. Surveillance coverage of the self-excluded patron was incomplete because the camera at the approved site for the Rush Rewards desk was not covering the desk at the time the self-excluded patron accessed services. However, the investigation did determine that at 9:21 p.m., while at the Rush Rewards desk, the self-excluded patron was issued a new account and new player's card. The self-excluded patron's status in Sugar House Casino's management system at the time was that he was self-barred and he should not have been issued an account and a player's card. The self-excluded patron went to a slot machine and began playing. By 9:45 p.m., the player services manager notified Sugar House security personnel that there was a patron on the board's self-exclusion list in the casino. Player services manager and security located the self-excluded patron in the casino and escorted him to the security room. The Pennsylvania State Police issued the self-excluded patron a citation for trespassing, and he was evicted from the casino. Chairman, Commissioners, the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Sugar House Casino respectfully request that the board approve the proposed consent agreement and stipulation settlement, which requires Sugar House to maintain policies and training to prevent similar violations of the board's self-exclusion list. The Sugar House pay a civil penalty of $33,000. They also pay a fee of $2,500 for costs incurred by the Office of Enforcement Counsel and other board staff in connection with the investigations and assessment and settlement of these incidents. I'm glad to answer any questions you may have. Mr. Don is here as well.
Thank you, Jim. I neglected to introduce who's with me before. Lynette Lee, who's the Director of Compliance, Dan McCall, who's the Director of Table Games, and Tony, and I'll spell this name, Delacroix, Dilacqua, who is the Director of Security, all three up at the dais with me. First two are, as I spoke of before, problems with people cashing out after they've been at least tentatively identified as being on the exclusion list, which we've addressed. The number one, the patron was not confrontational, but the second one, according to what the stipulation states, he was confrontational. And, of course, we've advised people not to get in fistfights or arguments with patrons who are confrontational. The third one was that this patron should have never been issued a Rush Rewards card. And the person who issued that got a written warning in their file, and presumably that will not happen again with that particular human being. The last one was a human error in issuing the card, which shouldn't have happened. The first two were kind of these judgment things where someone's either confrontational or they're trying to figure out whether he's actually on the list. But the future, hopefully, people have been trained. Future people won't let them get their hands on the chips, if possible, and certainly won't let them cash out at the cage.
Any questions or comments from the board?
I don't want to open a Pandora's box on this stuff, but Cyrus, how many people are on the exclusion list?
A little over 9,000.
Is that excluded and self-excluded? That's
only self-excluded.
Just self-excluded.
On the exclusion list, don't quote me.
No.
For some reason, either
it's a public meeting. Sorry.
Cyrus,
hold me to it.
Cyrus, is this off the record on the public record?
For some reason, the number 400 comes to mind. So I can't, but I know the self-exclusion is over 9,000.
Okay. And the point I want to make is, when I listen to this, if a player is not rated, doesn't have a player's card, doesn't have a rewards card. How do we ever catch these guys? Now, I don't think they have any excuse. When somebody's rated has a player's card and then goes back in with a player's card and they don't pick it up, I have no sympathy. But when there's 9,000 to 10,000 people on an exclusion list, and we come down hard on these casinos, how can we expect them to know the 9,000 or 10,000 people on that list, especially if they aren't rated, they don't have a card, they don't. There's no player's card, there's no rewards card. How can we expect them to enforce that? I just think that we have to be somewhat more sympathetic in some of these cases. Again, when there's a player's card issued and the guy's on the exclusion list and they don't pick it up, I don't have any sympathy for them at all. But if somebody walks into the casino, lives in Summit Hill, Pennsylvania, and goes down to Rivers in Pittsburgh or Mount Airy, that they don't know me from Adam and I'm not rated, how can we expect the casinos to go after those people?
Okay, I'm going to answer your question seriously, okay, because we don't expect them to be 100%, because we see people on the self-exclusion list that violate that list just about every day, okay? So if we find the casino every time that happens, we wouldn't have any more casinos in Pennsylvania. You'd be surprised how often they do catch them, and when they catch them, we don't usually do anything to the casino if the individual did not give a form of identification, if there was no way to recognize them. You'd be surprised how often surveillance will track somebody, or somebody that works for the casino will recognize somebody. Our patron will recognize somebody and say, oh, hey, I know his wife, and he's supposed to be on the list, and will notify security. All sorts of things. In those instances where they have no way of knowing, or where they just happen to recognize the person, we usually don't do anything to the casinos. In situations where identification is shown and the person is rated, or the person is recognized and the chips are not confiscated and the person's allowed to leave and nobody's notified, those are the instances where we take action usually against the casinos. Only in instances where we say, hey, you didn't do what you were supposed to do once you identified the self-excluded person, or you should have identified the self-excluded person when you, rather than issue them a Players Club card or cashing out their chips or even handing chips over to them because you had their identification or you identified them and you let them walk away with it. So in those situations, but even for those on the state exclusion list, if they don't identify them or there's no reason for them to identify them and they just skate by, we don't usually do anything to the casinos.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other questions from the board? I have a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the consent agreement between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and HSP Gaming LP as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? The motion's adopted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
The next matter on the agenda is a consent agreement that has been negotiated between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Washington Trotting Association doing business as the Meadows. The matter will be presented by Senior Enforcement Counsel Glenn Stewart.
Thank you, Glenn Stewart for the Office of Enforcement Counsel, STUART. The next matter for the board's consideration is a consent agreement between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Category 1 licensee Washington Trotting Association, Incorporated, doing business as the Meadows Racetrack and Casino. This consent agreement addresses self-exclusion violations. The first count of the consent agreement addresses an instance where a self-excluded person was afforded access to the Meadows gaming floor and was allowed to wager at a blackjack table. The self-excluded person wagered for approximately 2 hours along with a companion. The self-excluded person was allowed to cash out $700 in chips and then left the facility. His companion then attempted to cash out $6,500 in chips. However, in accordance with the Meadows' internal controls regarding suspicious wagering activity, the cage cashier noted that the companion was attempting to cash out more than the Meadows' threshold for a transaction during a gaming day. A reconciliation of the companion's wagering activity showed that he won only $510 that day. As such, it was believed that the companion was attempting to cash out another person's chips, and his cash-out request was refused. The companion was then allowed to leave the facility with the $6,500 in chips. The surveillance department was already notified of the possible agent transaction, but the cage did not immediately notify board staff, the satellite cage, or security of a possible agent transaction. After reviewing the data of patrons entering the casino and backtracking their movements, Meadow Surveillance confirmed that the self-excluded person was indeed on the self-exclusion list. After this review, board staff and other departments were notified. Approximately 4 hours later, the self-excluded person returned to the Meadows. Again, he was afforded access to the gaming floor. He immediately went to a satellite cage where he was allowed to cash out $1,000 in chips. As the self-exclusion person was exiting the casino, a Meadows security officer approached him and advised that he was not permitted in the casino because he was on the self-exclusion list. The self-excluded person was then allowed to leave the property with $1,000 in cash. The second count of the consent agreement addresses a third-party vendor sending promotional emails on behalf of the Meadows to individuals on the self-exclusion list. The issue was initially brought to light when a self-excluded person won a jackpot while wagering at a slot machine. The self-excluded person left the property without collecting the jackpot, but returned to the Meadows later that day to turn himself in. When talking with board staff, the self-excluded person advised that he had received promotional emails from the Meadows website portal named WebPass. A subsequent BIE investigation into WebPass revealed that access to WebPass is achieved through the Meadows website. WebPass is not affiliated with the Meadows Players Club. Rather, WebPass is maintained and monitored by a third-party vendor named Engaged Nation. Engaged Nation is not a licensed entity with the board. Patrons can only sign up for a WebPass account through the Meadows website. A patron creates an account by providing a username and password, as well as checking boxes acknowledging that the patron is 21 years of age or older and is not on the self-exclusion list or the exclusion list. BIE's investigation confirmed that the Meadows did not provide Engaged Nation with a list of self-excluded persons. Neither Meadows nor Engaged Nation cross-checked the Pennsylvania self-exclusion list after a patron created an account through WebPass. The Meadows conducted a subsequent scrub of the Engaged Nation member list against the Pennsylvania self-exclusion list. This scrub revealed that 91 individuals on the board's self-exclusion list received promotional emails from Meadows through WebPass. The terms of the consent agreement would require the Meadows to pay a civil penalty in the amount of $40,000 for allowing 2 self-excluded individuals to gain access to its gaming floor, for allowing 2 self-excluded individuals to place wagers, for allowing 1 self-excluded individual to cash out winnings as a result of his wagering, for failing to confiscate winnings from 1 self-excluded individual, and for allowing a third-party vendor to send promotional emails to 91 individuals on the self-exclusion list on behalf of the Meadows. This consent agreement is now ripe for the board's consideration.
Morning,
Comment.
Mr. Chairman, board members. Marie Jones on behalf of Washington Trotting Association. With me today is Michael Keelan, Director of Compliance for WTA, and Kevin Brogan, Director of Marketing for WTA.
Do you have any comments?
The comments I have is with respect to the WebPass, we have since put in a policy where each time a new account is started and each time emails go out to all the patrons, they then scrub the list, so it's now consistent. It isn't like it was done previously as a one-time shot. Originally, when we started WebPass, they thought of it more as a promotional, non-gaming area, since it wasn't directly tied to the casino gaming, and that's why it was not initially done. The scrubbing wasn't initially done with respect to the exclusion list.
Any questions or comments from the board on this? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the consent agreement between the Office of Enforcement Counsel and Washington Trotting Association as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? The motion is adopted. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next 3 matters on the agenda consist of enforcement actions in which the Office of Enforcement Counsel has filed complaints seeking the revocation of 2 non-gaming registrations and 1 gaming permit issued to individuals by the board. Each complaint has been filed with the board's Office of Hearings and Appeal and properly served upon the individual named in each complaint. The individual named in each complaint failed to respond within 30 days as required by board regulation. As a result, the Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a request for default judgment and properly served the same upon each named individual. All filed documents have been provided to the board, and the matters are presently ripe for the board's consideration. In each instance, we'll provide a brief summary of the facts and request the appropriate board action.
Thank you. Again, Glenn Stewart for the Office of Enforcement Counsel. Next for the board's consideration is the revocation of Monique Presley's gaming permit. Ms. Presley was most recently employed as a slot attendant at the Meadows Racetrack and Casino. Ms. Presley has recently been arrested on 2 separate occasions and charged with crimes ranging from felony aggravated assault to driving under the influence. All criminal charges remain pending against Ms. Presley at this time, and she has a June 27, 2016 non-jury trial for both those separate charges. As such, the revocation of Monique Presley's gaming permit is now ripe for the board's consideration.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the revocation of Monique Presley's gaming employee occupation permit as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Good morning, Chairman Barish, members of the board. David Tepper, T-E-P-P-E-R, with the Office of Enforcement Counsel. I have for your consideration today a complaint to revoke the non-gaming employee registration of Tymee Gant. Mr. Gant was arrested on 2 separate occasions in a 1-week span, one for breaking into a house and the other for driving under the influence. Mr. Gant has subsequently entered pleas in both cases, and at this point the Office of Enforcement Counsel is requesting that the board revoke Tymee Gant's non-gaming employee registration.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the revocation of Tymee Gant's non-gaming employee registration as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
The next matter before the board is a request to consider the revocation of Eric Rodriguez's non-gaming employee registration, which was issued in connection with his former position as a cook at Mohegan Sun Casino. In May of 2015, Mr. Rodriguez applied for a gaming permit in connection with a promotion to table games dealer, and in November of 2015, the board denied Mr. Rodriguez's application based on his failure to become compliant with the Department of Revenue. As Mr. Rodriguez has still failed to comply with the Department of Revenue, the Office of Enforcement Counsel now requests that the board revoke the non-gaming registration held by Eric Rodriguez.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the revocation of Eric Rodriguez's non-gaming employee registration as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
The remaining 18 matters on the agenda consist of enforcement actions in which the Office of Enforcement Counsel has filed petitions seeking the involuntary exclusion of individuals whose presence within the licensed facilities are inimical to the interests of the Commonwealth or licensed gaming therein. In each instance, the petition for exclusion has been filed with the Board's Office of Hearings and Appeal and properly served upon the individual named in the petition. The individual named in the petition failed to respond within 30 days. As a result, the Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a request for default judgment in each instance and probably served the same upon each individual. Therefore, all facts submitted are deemed admitted as facts in each petition, and the matters are presently ripe for the Board's consideration. Once again, we'll read a brief summary of the facts and request the appropriate action from the Board.
The next 3 matters on the agenda share the same fact pattern, and with the board's permission, I ask to read the fact pattern and then individually request that each party be placed on the exclusion list. 2 brothers, Thomas and Christopher Gordon, ages 19 and 17, gained access to and attempted to access the Rivers gaming floor while underage, both utilizing illegally manufactured identification. The brothers arrived at Rivers Casino with their aunt, Sandra Gordon, and a family friend, Leslie Stephen, who both aided and assisted Thomas and Christopher Gordon in accessing and attempting to access the gaming floor with illegally manufactured identification while underage. The Office of Enforcement Counsel now requests that the board add Sandra Gordon to the board's excluded persons list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Sandra Gordon to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list for a period of at least 1 year, at which time she may petition for removal from the list.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? The motion's adopted.
The Office of Enforcement Counsel now requests that the board add Thomas Gordon to the board's excluded persons list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Thomas Gordon to the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board involuntary exclusion list until at least his 22nd birthday, at which time he may petition for removal from the list.
All in favor? Oh,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
And the Office of Enforcement Counsel now requests that the board add Leslie Stevens to the board's excluded persons list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Leslie Stephen to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list for a period of at least 1 year, at which time she may petition for removal from the list.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, good morning. Kim Adams for the Office of Enforcement Counsel. The next matter for the board's consideration is the placement of Richard Ferragonio on the involuntary exclusion list for using counterfeit money to game while at Rivers Casino. At this time, the Office of Enforcement Counsel is requesting that he be placed in the involuntary exclusion list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Richard Ferragonio to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
The next matter for the board's consideration is the placement of Adam Douglas Bukowski on the involuntary exclusion list for breaking into and stealing numerous items, including a handgun, from various vehicles in the Presque Isle Downs and Casino parking lot. This time, the Office of Enforcement Counsel is requesting he be placed on the involuntary exclusion list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Adam Bukowski to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the board. Benjamin Farrell, Ferrell. The next two matters for your consideration share the same fact pattern, and with your permission, I'll read them together and then ask for their placement individually. On December 20th of 2015, while under 21 years of age, Sierra Tunyo used her husband's wristband to enter the gaming floor and game at Presque Isle Downs and Casino. Her husband, Jared Rumbold, allowed Mrs. Tunyo to use his wristband and accompanied her onto the gaming floor. At this time, OEC requests that the board place Sierra Tunyo on the board's involuntary exclusion list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Sierra Chunyo to the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board involuntary exclusion list until at least her 22nd birthday, at which time she may petition for removal from the list.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Additionally, OEC requests that the board place Jared Rumbold on the board's involuntary exclusion list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Jared Rumbo to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list for a period of at least 1 year, at which time he may petition for removal from the list.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Good morning, Chairman Barish, members of the board. Dustin Miller on behalf of the Office of Enforcement Counsel. The next matter today is a request for placement on the board's excluded persons list involving Casteel T. Butler. The Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a petition to place Mr. Butler on the exclusion list on January 4th, 2016 for stealing $1,000 worth of chips from a fellow patron at Parks Casino. Mr. Butler was charged with theft by unlawful taking and receiving stolen property due to the incident. Based upon the foregoing, the Office of Enforcement Counsel asks that the board place Casteel T. Butler on the board's excluded persons list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Casteel T. Butler to the Pennsylvania Game Control Board involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
The next matter today is a request for placement on the board's excluded persons list involving Kamasho Kamashak. The Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a petition to place Mr. Kamashak on the exclusion list on December 8th, 2015 for past posting 4 wagers while playing roulette at Parks Casino on October 24th, 2015, resulting in Mr. Kamashak being paid $1,226 to which he was not entitled. Based upon the foregoing, the Office of Enforcement Counsel asks that the board place Kamasho Kamashak on the board's excluded persons list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Kamasho Kamashak to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
The next matter today is a request for placement on the board's excluded persons list involving Nijaz Hasanagich. The Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a petition to place Mr. Hasanagich on the exclusion list on December 15, 2015 for past posting wagers while playing roulette at Parks Casino on September 8, 2015 and October 24, 2015. Mr. Hasanagich was also permanently banned from Valley Forge Casino in August of 2014 for impermissibly taking non-value roulette chips from the table. Based upon the foregoing, the Office of Enforcement Counsel asked that the board place Nijaz Hasanagich on the board's excluded persons list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Nijaz Hasanagich to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Good morning again, Chairman, Commissioners. James Armstrong for the Office of Enforcement Counsel. I have the next four matters for your consideration. The next one is a motion to consider a board order to add Brennan Thiel to the board's involuntary exclusion list. On January 7th of 2016, the Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a petition seeking to place Mr. Thiel on the board's excluded persons list as a result of his arrest for being in Sugar House Casino underage and for damaging a voucher redemption machine. He was charged with underage gambling, criminal mischief, and false information to law enforcement, as well as 4 summary offenses. Mr. Thiel ultimately pled guilty to disorderly conduct and was assessed fines and costs totaling $319.
Any questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Brennan Thiel to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Thank you. The next matter is a motion to consider board order to add Albert Cropper to the board's involuntary exclusion list. Commissioners, on January 7th, 2016, the Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a petition seeking to place Mr. Cropper on the board's excluded persons list as a result of his arrest for cheating during a 3-card poker game at Sugar House Casino. He was charged with sleight of hand or scheme, theft by deception, and disorderly conduct. He was arrested for switching cards between hands while playing 2 hands at a time. Mr. Cropper was found guilty of the theft by deception charge. He was assessed $215.50 in fines and costs in order to perform 24 hours of community service.
Any questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Albert Elliott Cropper to the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Thank you. The next matter is a motion to consider a board order to add Shakya Davidson to the board's involuntary exclusion list. Commissioners, on December 17th of 2015, the Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a petition seeking to place Ms. Davidson on the board's excluded persons list as a result of her arrest for being in Sugar House Casino underage and trying to cash a $25 check. She was charged with underage gambling. Ms. Davidson was found guilty and assessed fines and costs totaling $209.
Any questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Shakya Davidson to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list until at least her 22nd birthday, at which time she may petition for removal from the list.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Thank you. Next motion to consider the board order to add Andre Hayes to the board's involuntary exclusion list. Commissioners, on September 21st, 2015, the Office of Enforcement Counsel filed a petition seeking to place Mr. Hayes on the board's excluded persons list as a result of his arrest for allegedly robbing a patron of Sugar House Casino at gunpoint in the parking lot of the casino. Mr. Rodriguez was not charged with the robbery because the patron did not wish to prosecute. However, he was charged with defiant trespass because he he had been permanently evicted from Sugar House Casino for other disruptive behavior, including trying to steal other patrons' gaming chips, as well as stealing a tip off a restaurant table.
I have a question.
I think he meant Mr. Hayes.
Yes, right, yeah.
He just.
No, I have yet another question. Is there any evidence that he had been in the casino that day, or he's just lurking in the parking?
He was in a number of days. Actually, when
But I mean, the day when this robbery occurred.
I believe so. Yeah, I'd have to check on that.
And
But he was identified through surveillance as being the subject that robbed the patron. And he appeared again 2 weeks later, and that's when he was taken into custody with the patron.
Guess what I was wondering is, you may not know, but from the review of the tape, is it apparent that he had that gun on him while he was in the casino?
Not very clear. The patron said it was a gun. He actually robbed $35 from the patron, went back into the casino, and bought in, I believe, at a blackjack game for $35.
But prior to the robbery, had he been in the casino that day, and do we have any evidence whether or not he had a gun while he was in the casino prior to the robbery?
I'm not sure. I could check that for you.
I'd be curious.
No, I doubt we have evidence that he had a gun in the casino, because if we had that evidence, they would have immediately taken action at that time. So I doubt we have evidence of him being in the casino.
I was kind of figuring, when you look back, you could see a bulge or something that might have tipped you off.
Well, a bulge can be anything.
Yes, it can. Okay. Any questions or other comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Andrew B. Hayes to the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Good morning. Michael Rowland, ROL A&D with the Office of Enforcement Counsel. Next is a request to place Than Fan on the involuntary exclusion list. Mr. Fan attempted to pickpocket a patron on the gaming floor while at Sands Casino. Mr. Fan was not charged by the Pennsylvania State Police because the victim did not want to pursue the matter. However, he was permanently evicted. The matter is now before the board to consider the placement of Than Fan on the board's involuntary exclusion list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Than Fan to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
Next is a request to place Xavier Valentin on the involuntary exclusion list. Mr. Valentin was observed capping his bet while playing Texas Hold'em at Sands Casino. He was permanently evicted by Sands security but not criminally charged because he made full restitution. He actually capped for $10 and had a benefit of $150. The matter is now before the board to consider the placement of Xavier Valentin on the board's involuntary exclusion list.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Xavier Valentin to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list as described by the Office of Enforcement Counsel.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
And the last two matters arise from the same fact pattern and involve the request to place Cody Emery and Tyler Emery on the involuntary exclusion list. Cody Emery, age 22, assisted his underage brother, Tyler Emery, age 19, with gaining access to the gaming floor at Sands Casino. Cody Emery had a valid duplicate identification, which he gave to Tyler Emery to help him gain that access. Tyler Emery was on the gaming floor for approximately 41 minutes. He did not consume alcohol or engage in gaming. Cody Emery was not charged by the Pennsylvania State Police. However, Tyler Emery was charged by the Pennsylvania State Police with an individual under 21 on the gaming floor. That's under our Act 1518A13. Tyler Emery did enter a guilty plea to that charge. First, the matter is now before the board to consider the placement of Cody Emery on the board's involuntary exclusion.
Questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Cody Emery to the PGCB involuntary exclusion list for a period of at least 1 year, at which time he may petition for removal from the list.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
And last, we ask the board to consider the placement of Tyler Emery on the board's involuntary exclusion list.
Any questions or comments from the board? May I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board issue an order to approve the addition of Tyler Emery to the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board involuntary exclusion list until at least his 22nd birthday, at which time he may petition for removal from the list.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted.
That concludes our business. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the business for today's meeting. Our next scheduled public meeting will be held on Wednesday, May 25th. The meeting will begin at 10 a.m. in this room. Are there any other comments from members of the board or ex officio? May I have a motion adjourning the meeting?
Mr. Chairman, I move we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion's adopted. The meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Amen. Hallelujah.
Yeah.
I almost said something I forgot.
We needed some lightning.
Yeah, right. Can you elaborate? Or you're just happy to see me? Yeah, that's right.
Never given Cyrus an opening like that again.
By the way, did you notice? Nothing but staff in here for the last 10 minutes.
No, they are.
All right.